going to warn everybody, my voice is still going in and out, so if I get real quiet, you'll just have to listen a little extra carefully. When Wayne asked for folks who would be willing to speak during Pride this year, I sort of did an automatic, I'd love to do that. And then I sort of read a little further and said, individual perspective. What do we mean by that? But I didn't ask. I let my mind play with it. And for the last 2 weeks, particularly, I've been going through one of those germinating things of, well, what is my perspective, For decades now, I've been doing the Bible doesn't really say what you think it does, read it. I've been doing we are just like everybody else, and we're not like everybody else, and we belong. We need the right to be married. We need this. And all of the causes, they've all been there, and they've all been part of who I've been and what I've done. Trying to understand why things have been the way they've been, has been a focus of my perspective, my head perspective on pride and what it means. And I know maybe it was last year or the year before when I talked about people who have their paradigms with my little styrofoam balls and sticks. I know you remember my playing with those. That when you take someone's paradigm where everything they know about life is hooked on this framework and you give them something that doesn't fit and they feel like their framework is being destroyed, they feel like they're maybe even going to die, they can't breathe because it makes everything questioned. And maybe that's why it's so hard for us to get to each other on either side of the arguments that go around pride. Within our own community, there are a lot of folks who say, well, why do we need to do pride anymore? We just want to be part of everybody else. And I know that Wayne spoke about that a couple of weeks ago, and I've chewed on that. And from my perspective, the struggles that I've gone through around sexuality have been about knowing when I was a very young child that something was different, but not being able to name it. I just knew, and I'm going to date myself here, so be ready. I just knew that that Ozzie and Harriet picture wasn't for me. And now, I did not fit in that shoebox, no way, shape, or form. And then there are a lot of shoeboxes that got presented through life. And I can remember just, not having a sense of it, but having these sort of different things that somehow I knew it wasn't safe to talk about. And it wasn't safe to say anything about. And for me, I think, and for many people, that grows that sense of, you just don't talk about who you are. You just don't reveal yourself to people. I can remember in college having a discussion with somebody who'd grown to be one of the best friends, and she's remained a best friend of mine, and having this thought that if you knew, you wouldn't like me anymore. I had internalized that message so powerfully. So things like Stonewall and all of the kinds of Harvey Milk, just, I don't want to go through the last 30 years and all of the things, the highlights and lowlights that have been there, but, they bounce you and they make you think, and often their reaction is, a little bit of anger and more determination to just kind of get on and change things. But the other part of that for me is that this struggle has always been paired with the civil rights struggle in general and for African American people in particular. I grew up in a household where the N-word was used more than any other place I ever saw. My family was not a model family. My family didn't fit the Ozzie and Harriet kind of picture either. We had lots of issues and lots of reasons that I might not want my family to be seen so much by other people, as well as doing a little hiding myself. But what it did is it sensitized me, because I could not abide hearing these things and having them said and acted on in my own home. it felt like someone was kind of tearing at my soul every time something like that happened. I grew up in a very integrated neighborhood. In fact, there were like 22 kids in my class, and I think there were 4 white kids. You know, I was really the minority in my grammar school. So for me, there was just this big dichotomy and disparity between what went on for me all day in school and what, you know, I heard and saw when I came to home. And I have just never in the core of my being been able to understand, why do we get so hyped about these differences? And in this last 2 weeks, that's the core of what this is all about for me, and what are the questions that remain. I mean, I thought, well, you know, we have the right to marry in Maryland, we have it in a number of states, we have Doe's been struck down, we have so many things that have changed, we have whole denominations that not only accept us and can walk in the door and be part of the church, but we can actually be ordained and, you know, play on the organ or the piano. I mean, there have been so many positive changes. But then we still have John Quejones going into a store and setting up a scenario where 2 gay men are sitting and having dinner together, and he has reactions from the people in the store about them talking in what was obviously in very intimate fashion, and then another scenario where they're holding hands, and then a third scenario where they actually kissed. And if you know that show, you know, what would you do? You can sort of imagine for yourself, if you haven't seen that segment, what the reactions in this restaurant in Middle America were like. And they ran the whole gamut. And I sat there and I looked at this and said, you know, how do we stop doing this? Because for me, that's what I want. When I sit here and I'm with pride and we're going to celebrate, I want to know, how can we be a force to change this bullshit? You can tell I got worked up this last 2 weeks a little bit. As I went through that, I thought a lot about a woman who's kind of I don't quite know what to describe. I guess it's human growth potential movement is what we used to call it back in the 70s. I think now it's just about learning about diversity in each other. But there's a woman named Jane Elliott. She was, I think, a 3rd grade teacher I actually brought some papers so I would remember some of the details correctly. Riceville, Iowa. On the morning of April 5th, 1968, that day may ring to you, Stephen Armstrong stepped into Jane Elliott's 3rd grade classroom in Riceville, Iowa, and said, "Hey, Mrs. Elliott, they shot that king yesterday. Why'd they shoot that king?" All 28 children found their desks, and Elliott said she had something special for them to do to begin to understand the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. the day before. She had thought about this the night before because she felt this was a drastically important thing to be able to talk to her kids about. She asked them, how do you think it would feel to be a Negro boy or girl? It would be hard to know, wouldn't it, unless we actually experienced discrimination ourselves. Would you like to find out? Everybody said yeah and raised their hands, and so what many people describe as one of the most astonishing exercises ever conducted in an American classroom took place. It's 37 years ago. She separated out the blue-eyed and the brown-eyed children. She pulled out green construction paper armbands and asked each of the blue-eyed kids to wear one so that they could be seen from across the room or the playground and know that they were the blue-eyed children. And then she told them, the brown-eyed people are the better people in this room. They are cleaner and they are smarter. She knew the children weren't going to buy her pitch unless she came up with a reason, and the more scientific to these space-age kids of the 60s, the better. eye color, hair color, and skin color are caused by a chemical, melanin, and it causes intelligence. The darker your eyes, the smarter you are. Blue-eyed people, well, you know, they just sit around and do nothing. You give them something nice and they just wreck it. And she could almost feel the chasm forming between the two groups of students in the room. So she asked, do blue-eyed people remember what they've been taught? No, said the brown-eyed kids. She rattled off the rules for the day. Blue-eyed kids had to use paper cups as they drank from the water fountain. Why? One girl asked. Because we might catch something, a brown-eyed boy said. Everyone looked at Miss Elliott and she nodded. As the morning wore on, brown-eyed kids berated their blue-eyed classrooms. What do you expect from him, Mrs. Elliott? He's a blue. And then the inevitable, Miss Elliott, how come you're the teacher if you've got blue eyes? And a brown-eyed boy asked. And before she could answer, another boy piped up, if she didn't have blue eyes, she'd be the principal or the superintendent. Lunch, and then back in the classroom, Elliott's experiment had taken on a life of its own. A smart, blue-eyed girl who had never had problems with multiplication tables started making mistakes. She slumped. At recess, 3 brown-eyed girls ganged up on her. You'd better apologize to us for getting in our way because we're better than you are. And the blue-eyed girl apologized. On Monday, she reversed the exercise. And the brown-eyed kids were told how dumb, shiftless, and lazy that they were. Later, it would occur to Elliott that the blueies were much less nasty than the brown-eyed kids had been, perhaps because the blue-eyed kids had felt the sting of being ostracized and didn't want to inflict it on their former tormentors. When the exercise ended, some of the kids hugged, some cried. Elliott reminded them that the purpose of the lesson was to understand the King assassination and to ask them to write down what they had learned. Typical of their response was that of W.'s, who reported that the people in Miss Elliott's room who had brown eyes got to discriminate against the people who had blue. I have brown eyes. I felt like hitting them if I wanted to. I got to have 5 extra minutes of recess. And the next day, when the tables would turn, I felt like quitting school. I felt mad. Now I know that's what it feels like when you're discriminated against. For her, ingenuity, creativity, and willingness to take on a very challenging issue in a very different way, she was pretty much ostracized in her hometown and chastised. People thought these kids were too young for this. People thought all kinds of things. But what she found is that decades later, those children in that class came back to her and thanked her for having done that class without exception. That they understood the world in a very different and more powerful way. Since that time, and if you have any interest in seeing this, this was filmed. She's done 4 or 5 more films that are available on her website. I urge any of you to go and look her up and look at her materials. I took part in a training exercise where somebody emulated one of her exercises, where they took adults and just divided them arbitrarily into 2 groups and made one group sit on the floor in a room by themselves and not give them any information, and let the other one go through a process that was supposedly for hiring for jobs. And you should have seen what people turned from it. What happens for me in this exercise, in every instance on the day-to-day of people putting other folks down, is that we don't see the people. We don't look into their eyes and see who they are and what they feel and what they think and what their hopes and desires are. What we see is something that we can allow our fears of success or failure or ignominy or our shame to be pinned on. We're not so bad if somebody's worse, I think is probably the root of it. I think that for me, when I think about this and I think about my struggles with sexual identity and my struggles with other issues in my life, what I have found is that when I have been separated out or been made to feel less or different, what I want to do is hide. I don't want to be wearing that green collar. I we'll just pull away. We know that when gay youth are having a struggle trying to identify what's going on in their lives and how they're going to handle it, that kind of isolation, that tendency to pull away and to just not be seen is very, very powerful, and it makes getting past that time in their lives incredibly difficult. And so, as I have gone through and through and through this and tried to reassess for myself what pride is about, it goes back to another one of Jane Elliott's comments. See if I remember this one correctly, but she asks, do you really believe that a person of color feels honored when you say, as a white person, that you don't see color, you just see people? Do you really think they feel honored because you're erasing their African American heritage to make us all fit in? That's not going to help us. That's not going to work for us. That's not going to help us solve the problems in Russia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in China, in the US. It's not going to help us to create gender equality, to create racial equality, to stop the different kinds of stereotyping that happen in all kinds of different ways. I think that what's going to stop it is when we start doing things like Jane Elliott did with those very young children. Maybe modified a little bit so it's not quite so harsh, because let me tell you, she's a little rough around the edges. She's not a gentle person. I think she likes to try to be, but she doesn't succeed at it very well. And so perhaps it would be a little less upsetting to some parents if it were redesigned and done in a different way. But if we could put ourselves in that kind of position so that nobody who's up has a lack of understanding of what it's like to be down, I think the world would change. And what that means to me is that we have to learn to see all of ourselves, all of each other, to see it, to see who we are. Not just, she's got curly hair and glasses, that's Beth, you know? But who is Beth? What does she wish for and dream in life? And to understand, and I can extrapolate some, I can say, I'm a human being. I want to be loved, I want to be cared for, I want to be honored. I want to be included, but I don't want to be made the same. God, don't shove me into that Harriet Nazi box. So to me, it is the dance of difference and the ability to say to someone, to look into their eyes and to really see and get comfortable. Because, you know, when are we not comfortable? You know, eye contact, it's one of those things that we find challenging as human beings. But when we do it, it changes everything. When you truly see someone for all of whom they are, all of their humanity and all of their divinity, you cannot put a green collar on and say they don't count. You can't do it anymore. And so for me, that's what pride is all about. Should we ever stop having pride? No. Do I still have a hard time with the guys in the leather chaps and the jock straps at pride parades? Yes. But will I ever say, no, go be invisible? No. That's my problem. That's not theirs. We need to be able to see each other in all of our glory, all of our color, all of our shapes, and honor what we see, and not paint a picture that's easier for our paradigm, for our mind, for our prejudices to accept. We need to celebrate not only our own Pride Day, but maybe it's time to think about going to some of those other ethnic festivals, participating and celebrating all of those differences. I know that you understand that I don't mean that we accept every evil thing human beings do as celebrating all of our differences. It's not the same thing. But today is a day where, after watching some things that were very disturbing for me, listening to some things that challenged me, thinking about my own history and the things that hurt and things that helped, looking back at my sort of, maybe not superhero, but kind of hero, Jane Elliott, and the work that she did and that others have done, I feel more strongly than ever that really what it's all about is one-on-one. All are welcome. We are all children of Rainbow Promise. We are all part of God's creation. We are all different, and yet in the most powerful ways we are all the same. And if we can just remember 3 or 4 times a day to say, I see you, maybe not out loud, but just, when you're sitting across the conference table and somebody's really getting on your nerves and you just can't take them anymore, just stop and look and think, I see you. I don't just see your stupid arm. I see you, a person with a life and who wants love and happiness and will appreciate kindness and compassion. Maybe not always, but most of the time. I see you as the divine and human being that you are. If that's what we took away as our mode of operation and a lesson learned from Pride, and could spread that around our community and out into the world, I think we could change even more than what has happened in the last 20 years. I cherish the changes that have happened, but I want so much more for all of us. Amen.